So,
I leave it a little bit.
a few years ago, a colleague of mine who had worked for Hyundai Electronics, and I met him when I was teaching and directing the Korea Mobile Telecom Global Training Program at the University of Colorado. And he told me he was unaware that anybody was doing research on Korea, any American scholars. So he said, later in one of our meetings, he said, yeah, you're writing the modern history of telecommunications in Korea. And in a sense, that's what this is all about. Thank you all for coming. Everybody showed up here. We got a mix of graduate students and faculty. And I'll confess to you, the slide deck I put together is a little bit long, and we go until about
It's scheduled until 2 p.m., but you may end whenever you want. I recommend some open questions at the end time.
Yeah, I'd like to open questions
I have student
about an hour from now, and not even maybe less. So I'm going to skip through some of these slides very quickly. But it's a three-part presentation. First part of it, which is maybe the most lengthy, I'll talk about what I like to call the digital network revolution globally, and then with some emphasis on what knowledgeable people here in Korea call the 1980s telecommunications revolution in Korea, which set the stage for everything we're experiencing today. The second part of the presentation, I'll touch on policy leadership, public-private partnership, and just sort of some quantitative line graphs that show growth in digital infrastructure and main patterns over time. Finally, I'll conclude on the future shape of digital networks and some lessons from Korea. And this is where it's good that I'll open up to questions, because one of the new elements, latest elements in my own research has been the addition of a more explicit focus on green growth and sustainability. And we have here today the co-chairman of the Presidential Council on Green Growth under Myung Oh, Professor Yang Suk-il. So you feel free to chime in, Suk-il, because this is the sketchiest part probably of my whole presentation. I like Yochai Benkler's book, The Wealth of Networks, but there are many others that show that we are in the so-called digital network era. First and foremost among them, the several books that Manuel Castells has written, his trilogy, The Rise of the Network Society. And there's been a lot of attention, even industry consulting groups like McKinsey and others are focusing on the digital disruption or the digital transformation, digitization, and so forth. My own work, I was introduced to Dr. Oh Myung in 1992 before the Daejeon Expo. He was chairman of the organizing committee. And with some help from him, I spent 2 years with a grant from DACOM and wrote this book on the telecommunications revolution in Korea. It was limited partly by my knowledge of Korean language. 아직까지 전 축구 때까지 한국어 공부하겠지만, I mean, I'm better now in terms of use of Korean language sources. So fast forwarding, back in 2007, Dr. Oh and I decided to co-author this book, which was published in 2011. And just before that, I had left the Fulbright Commission, and I wrote this Kindle book, which I will promise you this afternoon, it's available on Kindle, but I'll make it free for the next 5 days. So don't download it. I wrote most of this out in Kanwando at the place my wife and I have, just out of my head, based on Peace Corps memories and my memories over the years of what's gone on in terms of telecommunications development. The title of this presentation comes from this article that I got published in Telecommunications Policy. The article focuses on a set of research questions. Really, these are the hows and whys to try to provide a context through which especially Western or other international scholars could understand how in the world this happened in Korea, the so-called miracle on the Han. Now, Ev Rogers was my dissertation supervisor at Stanford, so I'm using his definition of innovation. And innovation, Rogers said, is an idea, practice, or object that is perceived as new by an individual or other unit of adoption. So in that article, Telecoms Policy article, I looked at network-centric digital development in Korea, looked at networks as an innovation. The first sentence of the introduction states that the digital network revolution originated in the mid-20th century. However, the diffusion of this innovation to countries around the world was an uneven process, proceeding more quickly in advanced developing economies than in the poor developing ones, leading to scholarly concern with the concept of the digital divide. And the most vivid and poignant example of the digital divide is right here on the Korean Peninsula. It's the DMZ, which I hope in the future does become sort of a peace zone or a digital media zone. Rename it.
DMC.
But, so anyway, this revolution, back when I was in grad school, and Lasswell's model was required reading. He was a political scientist at the University of Chicago. His model says, who says what to whom, through which channel, with what effect. It allows different types of communication research. I'm conscious of, we've got Whitaker as a sociologist. Here we've got people trained in other, we've got an economist in Yangtze-Gil. Wilbur Strand, the founder, probably the founder of the field of communication research as a multidisciplinary field. He wrote many times that communication is the fundamental social process. I think we're coming to realize that more and more these days. A little later than Lasswell published his, Claude Shannon published his famous mathematical theory of communication. And it shared with Lasswell's model certain characteristics. One-way, linear model. So we went from the industrial mass media era, during which I was born, to the digital network era, in which we're now living, the early years. And three developments spurred this. They all occurred. The year I was born, the transistor was invented. So the whole semiconductor industry took off. Some months later, Claude Shannon at Bell Labs published his mathematical theory of communication. And those two developments allowed engineers to figure out how to build digital switches, to begin digitizing networks. And the networks we have today all around the world are digital as a result. And just on this particular slide, you'll see some similar slides coming up. The World Wide Web didn't arrive really until 1992 for widespread public use. Google incorporated in 1998, and then the iPhone was released in June of 2007 in the United States. So mass communication back in the 20th century, where that was the whole frame of reference when I did my graduate work. Well, not entirely, because Stanford was right there in Silicon Valley, and in fact, Ed Rogers was very interested in network analysis, human network, and Ed Parker was teaching about Moore's law and digital and so forth. We're now in this era of decentralized, distributed, two-way, multipath, and viral communication. And it's sad for me to have to say, but this terrible incident in New Zealand was Facebook Live with a body camera, and it's out, the cat is out of the bag. That video will be available to anyone who knows how to navigate the web, from now on. So, in terms of the origins of the digital revolution, what I use in my teaching here and in my own research is that the invention of the transistor, Shannon's theory, and then digital switching are the three key breakthrough elements. They all occurred in the mid-20th century. The results, the impacts of these three developments were exponential growth in the human ability to store, compute, and communicate information. I highly recommend Martin Hilbert's work on this. I think he has his own website, hilbert.net, and all of his research is easily available. I think he's done, or he's at University of Southern California, I believe, which, by the way, is where Manuel Castells teaches. But the blue shading here shows this chart from one of his publications is just the telecommunication capacity. And you see in 1986, it was largely pink or analog, and the blue, which is digital, takes over. And this happened with storage and with computing capability as well. And this slide is from a slide share by Hilbert, and I'm happy to credit him because it's a much more visual slide than I had come up with on my own, but this is what I've been thinking for the past, since arriving at SUNY Korea and extending my research here. Claude Shannon, there's an excellent University of California video that I assigned to students on Shannon, and some former colleagues of his, and many people think he should have or would have won the Nobel Prize if enough time had only passed and people could see the impact of digitization. Now, I had been a Peace Corps volunteer and then later a Fulbright scholar in Korea and worked for 14 years with the Fulbright Commission from 1996 to 2010. So I was working in technology management for the Fulbright Commission at the time that changes were taking place in Korea that blew my mind, frankly. I mean, 1971-72, when I was living in Chuncheon teaching at Kangwon National University, you wouldn't believe that Korea today, in terms of communications infrastructure, would exist. The 1980s, I'll subsequently spend a little bit of time, but they started out with a telephone backlog crisis. That was overcome, and the blue line curve here, which you're all familiar with, is Korea's gross national income per capita. There are two major dips in it. One, the so-called IMF crisis, as it was known in Korea, the Asian financial crisis, and then in 2008 or 9, the global financial crisis, Lehman Brothers. And I'll talk later about smartphone shock. Now, all of this tremendous economic growth. Let me mention first, before I animate this slide, that the 1980s started out with Korea in rather desperate political, economic, and social shape. I won't talk a lot about that today, but it started out with this big telephone backlog that was completely eliminated by 1987, and by the end of the 1980s, electronics, which is what the ICT sector was called back then, was the lead sector in Korea's export-led economy. So there were a lot of political events that relate to Korea's economic growth, and I'll touch on some of those as we go through. Another thing, my own research really continues to focus on the 1980s, because that's when the revolution started, until the present. And one broad secular trend is the digital network revolution. The steady increase in power of semiconductors, the growing power and spread around the world of networks. Another secular trend is rapid urbanization. And these scientists from Brown University, I think they're economists, they did a study of light from outer space. And this is a photograph from outer space of the Korean Peninsula in 1992. Compared to 2008, you can see the growth of urbanization. And they proved quantitatively that light from outer space is a good proxy measure, reliable, and so forth, for economic growth. It's also a good proxy measure for digital development. And Korea became an urban nation, the small left-hand graph there, in the 1980s. So now this graph I pulled from an old slideshow. The top line is percentage of urbanization in South Korea, and the greenish dotted line under it is North Korea. So North Korea hasn't urbanized at all. You can see the dates at the bottom, which you can't. This starts back at 1980. Goes from 1980 through 2012 on the right-hand side. You can clearly see the colored lines. Well, you can clearly see on urbanization that the urbanization took place in the 1980s, and then it was close to 90% urban, so it levels off. And then the purple line is phone lines per 100 population, and the green line is mobile cellular per 100, and it goes up to 100. And by the way, in some later slides, the reason that cellular penetration goes above 100 is, in a couple words, is multiple SIM cards. So it's really valuable to know more than what the total number of subscriptions are in a country. For many countries, Japan, Korea, it can exceed 100. So this picture reminds me of my young Peace Corps days teaching English at Kangwon National University. The only place you could find a telephone was a tea room, some business people, and this is a photograph of something I saw with my own eyes many times, lining up to use a payphone, this phone right here. And this, we all have a common experience if we take the subway here. Everybody is online on the subway, essentially. So, another reason for calling this the title of the journal article, and actually Dr. O, I didn't say, I sort of passed over earlier, but just within the past few days, the editor we're working with at Routledge in London has turned over the second edition book manuscript to the production people, which means in 6 or 7 months, the book should actually be published with a new subtitle. But these key 1980-81 decisions, 4 of them. The development of the success of the TDX project for electronic switching, the 4 megabyte DRAM project, the allowance of color television broadcasting. Prior to 1980, Pak Chung-hee had been adamantly opposed to allowing color television. He felt that only the wealthy in the urban areas would have color television sets, so it would exacerbate social divisions between the rich and the poor in Korea. But he was assassinated in the fall of 1979, so in 1980, the young technocrats were able to, Kim Jae-ik and Dr. Oh Myung and others, they were able to finally push through color television. Their reasoning was, nobody will buy color television sets if you don't have color television broadcasting. Very simple, straightforward. And then the privatization of Korea Telecommunications Authority, the creation of KTA, and later that same year, I think, about the same year, Dacom Corporation. This was the largest reorganization in the history of the Korean government. 30-some thousand employees moved out of the Chaeshinbu, the Ministry of Communications, and literally they created a telecommunications sector in business terms where none had existed in Korea. There was only a government monopoly ministry. Now, this slide I put in, and by the way, this is sort of a hodgepodge of prior presentations and some new stuff from the new book manuscript that I wanted to share with you. But this, I've already said, 1980, things were in really a perilous state here. Pak Chung-hee had been assassinated in 1979. Politically, things led to the Kwangju Uprising, which is still in the news today. Kwangju Uprising in May of 1980, and Chun Du-hwan and his military colleague No Tae-woo, they took power in a staged military coup. But at the same time, in the summer of 1980, Kim Jae-ik, who was the chief economic advisor to President Chun, he carried over from the Park administration, he invited Oh Myung to dinner at Gwanghwamun. I think it was a bulgogi restaurant. But it was a restaurant in Gwanghwamun. There was a curfew. And the dinner went on. These two had attended the same high school, Gyeonggi High School, but they shared certain things, but Kim Jae-ik was a Stanford PhD in economics. Oh Myung was a Stony Brook PhD in electrical engineering. But Kim Jae-ik had visited Taiwan, and he knew that Taiwan already had digital switching. And so they talked about digital switching, and at that dinner, they said to each other, you know, we missed the Industrial Revolution. And their discussion was to the effect, if we don't catch the information revolution, we may remain a developing country forever. I wish I had the transcript of that dinner, but it's famous in lore among people who know the sector here. The telephone backlog crisis, I'll show you some slides in a minute. And so at the end of that dinner, Kim Jae-ik invited Oh Myung to come and work in the Blue House. He then worked for 8 months in the Blue House at the same time that Yang Suk-il, our colleague, was working in a different Blue House office. So 8 months at the Blue House, and then Kim Jae-ik decided to dispatch Oh Myung to the Chaeshinbu, the Ministry of Communications. The biggest accomplishment during the 8 months Oh Myung spent with Kim Jae-ik in the Blue House was the long-term plan to foster the electronics sector. And in the second edition of my book with Dr. Oh, Dr. Oh being the principal author. One thing I can tell you is there's expanded treatment of the 1980s and expanded treatment of the long-term plan. Dr. Oh and Kim Jae-ik, both U.S. trained PhDs, pulled together 20-plus experts from government, research institutes, and industry. Half a dozen or so of them, I don't have the exact figures, were U.S. trained PhDs. All the rest almost were from Seoul National or Yonsei or Korea University. It was the bright young technocrats. And what they did would later be referred to in academic literature as the triumph of the technocrats. Just to show you, this is in the new book, but it's not in the first edition. This is Korea's GDP growth, annual percentage growth. It's a very interesting chart because it starts back in 1981 and it goes all the way through 2017. And you'll notice there are only 2 times that the growth rate dipped below 0. One was the summer of 1980. Yeah, and it's vividly shown here. The other was the IMF crisis. And during the IMF crisis, I was back here working for Fulbright, full-time, the Fulbright Commission. And I remember just down the street, there was a small restaurant. It's called the IMF Shikdan. There were IMF Shikdans, IMF Cholmojang. They were popping up all over. People were donating their family jewelry. I mean, the IMF crisis was really, really something. And this is a semi-colored version of a new chart that's going to be in the new book. It's based on a table that was published in an article by Metelka, Lynn Metelka, I think is her name. And she went back and quantified all the digital switches that were purchased by the Korea Telecommunications Authority, which was renamed Korea Telecom near the end of this period. And the dark red and blue are the different TDX switches, TDX1A, TDX1B, and TDX10. And what you can see is that as Dr. Oh and others had predicted, developing the TDX switch would help out in more than one way, including driving down the cost of putting switches into the network. You can see that dependence on the TDX, the 3 main TDX models increases greatly. It started back in the 80s, but the real impact is at the end of the decade and into the 1990s. So Korea became only the 10th country in the world to have the capability of manufacturing digital switches. This is a 1970 map in the Donghaeilbo predicting what Korea would look like in the year 2000. And it just contrasts to our thinking. This is a 2012 map showing penetration of the 3 major mobile LTE services. And the reason LGU Plus is more dense is that their license was granted earlier, so at this snapshot in time. Now, one of the themes that I still remember in 2008, I think it was, I was in Dr. Oh's office at Konkuk University, and he said, "Now, Dr. Larson," this was the meeting at which we agreed to co-author a book. He said to me, and more than once, but that time he said, "Dr. Larson, let's not focus only on the successes, but look also at the failures." And that's true for Western scholarship as well. I'll talk a little bit in terms of failures in terms of Korean policy, smartphone shock. and the delayed arrival of the iPhone. But Korea poses real problems for mainstream Western scholarships, and a great example of that, which I continue to use, is Broadband Korea, an internet case study. It was published in March 2003 by the ITU, and I've actually met Tim Kelly, the lead author, and I told him about the mistake in this study. And here it is, highlighted in blue. I'll just read the last part. It says, it's really egregious. The Korean alphabet, known as Hangul, uses a pictographic font that is not ideally suited to computerization. You could not make a bigger mistake than that. It should read, the Korean alphabet called Hangul uses an alphabetic font which is extremely scientific, phonetic, and ideally suited to computerization. They got it wrong.
Over there, they're referring to Chinese characters.
Yeah, they're referring to, and this has been only one example I'll use, but this is motivating my research. Because here I am, I'm living in Korea, enjoying these fast networks, and then trying to learn, Korean, Hangul. So, also in the study, the left-hand bar graph, as you can see, the bars claim, in fact, it's written there, waiting list eliminated in 1989. It looks like it's existed in 87 and 88. That's an error. The real data should be zero from the real data are in this bar graph put together from other data that we pulled up. But the red bar is the telephone backlog. The green lines are lines in use, and then the purple or blue is unused lines. But as your network grows, you need a certain size. So clearly, they got this one wrong too, in that, by 2 years. But I mean, it's a source of national pride here that the backlog was eliminated during the 1980s, and we're still talking about the revolutionary decade of the 1980s. Now, moving on to the second part of this. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. Yeah, okay. Second part of the presentation, I want to touch on, well, public-private partnership, really we can simply, I've kept this slide in here because Chalmers Johnson, who is the author or the originator of developmental state theory, wrote a book, MIDI and the Japanese Economic Miracle, in which he talked about developmental state theory. And public-private partnership, PPP here, was a major theme of his work. Now, the next few slides are based on data that I've gathered on broadband growth, looking at broadband growth in Korea over time. And I have to confess to you, and by the way, I'll share this slide deck later. You're all welcome to look at it, ask me if there's sources missing or something, if you're wondering about it. But back when this was put together from OECD data, broadband was still being thought of, well, this starts in 1990. Okay, starts from basically zero. And I'll talk a little bit more. Broadband, in terms of fixed broadband, really began in 1998 with a company called ThruNet, with cable modem service. So 1998, so you can see how steeply the curve goes up. This just simply compares Korea to a couple of the other leading countries over this time period, up until 2009, were Scandinavian. So Denmark, the Netherlands, I think Sweden and some of those countries were high as well. But what this really graphically shows is that from 1990 through 2005 or so, you know, Korea was way ahead of the rest. But keep in mind that this is fixed broadband. We'll talk about mobile in a moment. And okay, I want to, a purpose of my article in Telecommunications Policy and the second edition book with Dr. Oh is to help non-Korean scholars better contextualize what's going on in Korea. Why did it happen? How did it happen? What really is the Korean alphabet like? Is it phonetic or pictographic? You know, so very interesting, the relationship between the rise and fall of PC rooms, PC bonds in Korea, and the growth of broadband internet. Because I mentioned ThruNet. ThruNet offered cable broadband at what many people in the ministry thought was ridiculously low price, about $25 per month. There was debate going on in the ministry, how should we price it? But ThruNet just, you know, the company was owned by a well-known entrepreneur in Dr. Lee, who founded ThruNet. So they offered it at $25 per month at roughly the same time period. StarCraft, one of the first, really the first multiplayer, massive multiplayer online game, was becoming popular with middle and high school students. And so Hanaro wanted to enter the broadband market, and they came up with an advertising campaign aimed at parents. It said, subscribe to our DSL-based broadband, and your child can play StarCraft at home and won't stay out late at the PC box, right? The other interesting thing, so the fact that StarCraft, massive multiplayer online game, it's not insignificant that it was invented here in Korea. Esports, in that sense, their historical origin is right here, not in the US, because it relates directly to, broadband. You've got to have a high-speed connection to really make sense out of these, out of the type of connectivity that you need for. I'm not a gamer, but this is what I read and what I understand about games. So the other thing that's interesting to me, I managed to find data all the way through 2016 on the actual number of PC rooms. And this shows a couple of things, that from 2000 through 2009 was fairly level. It peaked out at about 23,000 PC rooms. And my explanation of that was that that's saturation, because that means there's a PC room in every city of any size throughout Korea, that you can find a PC room. But I think the decline up until 2016 reflects something broader, that maybe there's a switch over toward mobile games, play wherever you are, and also with fixed broadband speeds, fiber to the home increasing. So now, this is OECD data, and I've highlighted the two bars simply to see that the dark blue is the percentage of fiber, blue, not the dark blue, but the medium blue for Korea and Japan. And in fact, a different graph, which I don't think I have in this deck, shows that Korea and Japan are number 1, number 2 in terms of the percentage of fiber links now. And that's interesting because Dr. Kyung-Sung Hyun told me on a visit to Korea when I was years ago, when he was still minister of the MIC. He became minister in 1995. He told me personally that the failure to build out fiber to the home earlier could be considered a policy failure in Korea. That was his point of view as Minister of Information and Communication. So, just to be clear about mobile, here are some of the milestones. In 1993, the Korean government decided to adopt CDMA as its mobile standard. I interviewed Dr. Yang Sung-taek, who later became minister, but I interviewed him when he was president of ETRI in Daejeon. And I still remember he had a glint in his eye when he looked at me and he said, "Dr. Larson, we have decided to adopt CDMA." Now, I'm a social scientist, okay? But I could tell he was excited about this. He explained it's got so much more capacity. But at that time, that was a bold move, 1993, because Qualcomm was a small company in California that just owned a bunch of patents. It was nothing. That decision made Korea the first country in the world to commercialize CDMA. And so that was a positive success, and actually the revenues, the business revenue from exporting CDMA and everything was huge, even compared to the impact of TDX earlier. But in the period from the introduction of the iPhone in 2007 until 2009, there was this smartphone shock. You could go back and search Korean newspapers for smartphone shock, and you find that there were lots of articles over this 2-year period. There are 3 reasons why the smartphone shock. The mobile service providers, that's KT, SK Telecom, LGU+. They were all, I know this, I talked directly to a high-level SK executive. He said, we were afraid of losing voice revenue. Young people in Korea had already begun purchasing the iPod, the music player, and they were making free phone calls and so forth using their iPod. So the leadership of the mobile service providers feared a loss of voice revenue. The handset manufacturers, mainly led by Samsung and LG, they were very comfortable because Korea had almost universal use of CDMA-based phones, which the ITU and international bodies interpreted as broadband, mobile broadband. CDMA 3G telephony, I still remember my first phone. It was a mobile phone. It was a Motorola StarTAC. And technically at that time, I was carrying a phone capable of accessing data. But like everyone else in Korea, I hardly used the data service. Why? No pisayo. Yeah, it was way too expensive. But it was technically broadband, and Korea was way out ahead of the rest of the world. But the handset manufacturers couldn't figure out, iPhone, what is it? Actually, I can understand why Samsung and LG, why they couldn't quite figure it out, because the iPhone is not a phone. The real innovation is the apps ecosystem. It's a handheld computing device, more than a phone. So, and then finally, there's this WIPI requirement that Korea had, it's a law that they had put into place years earlier. It's a wireless interoperability platform for the internet. The leadership here hoped that that would become internationally adopted, but it never did. But it stayed there on the books and became, in effect, a non-tariff trade barrier. So shockingly, the iPhone was launched in June 2007. It was popular in more than 80 other countries around the world by the end of 2009. And it was only in December of 2009 that things were opened up to bring it in effectively in 2010. And this graph from the OECD shows mobile subscriptions per 100 population. And on the left, I put the red line in myself at 100. You can see the OECD average is over 100. And Korea is one of those countries where it's slightly over, but have to keep in mind, I mean, the difference between Korea and Japan here, Japan being number one, it's just simply that Japan has got a lot of SIM cards. You know, basically, people have many multiple SIM cards over there. So, now, this chart is another sort of long-term trend that shows up vividly. I got Nielsen's permission. This will be in the book. We got Nielsen's permission. But it's very interesting because this is based on panel data gathered from devices attached to personal computers. So this is, given that, this is PC use data, but it shows very clearly that there was a crossover in 2012, January of 2012, where Facebook exceeded Cyworld. And what makes this so remarkable is that Cyworld preceded Facebook by half a decade or more and was universally popular in Korea. But I think it illustrates the difficulty of trying to take something that takes off, you know, with the networks here in Korea and export that, perhaps the cultural influence. This chart, the dark part of the bars at the bottom is the government contribution to, this is gross expenditure on research and development. One thing about the digital network era is that R&D has become very, very important. And you can see that from 1975, this goes from 1975 up through 2008. And the government, a sharp decrease from the 1970s through the early 1980s in the government portion, then it increases a little bit. Currently, and I just took a screen capture, I didn't have time to redo this, but I discovered that there was 2017 data. This chart goes through 2017, and Korea has again edged ahead of Israel in 2017. Israel edged ahead in 2016. In 2015, Korea was number one in the world. So it's it's obscured here, 4.562, it's approaching 5% of gross domestic product. By the way, that theoretically should bode well for our Department of Technology and Society. One of our economists was mentioning to me that, you know, this R&D money, the research and development, the university role in the research part of that keeps the pie getting larger if we can compete with other would-be recipients of the grant. So this is another graphic showing how these key 1981 decisions. I mean, the long-term plan to digitize, to develop the electronics sector and so forth, how they contributed directly to. Now, this is a little bit older, 2012, 13, and 14. ICT exports on the rise. And here, I have, this is a chart that's going to appear in the book. Notice telecommunications equipment, which is the, it takes a dip, mobile phones, mainly competition from China and mobile phones accounts for the dip in the light gray line. And then there's a huge increase, the latest data being 2017, in semiconductor exports. Now, the next couple of slides actually illustrate the problem with a graph like this having a cutoff point, because semiconductors, again, integrated circuits exports, you see the line for Korea taking a sharp increase. It was called the super cycle in chip exports. This graph just shows you, the blue is Samsung's earnings from smartphones exports, and it's the start of a decrease in quarter 3 and 4, well, even before that, quarter 2 of 2014. And then this one, the dotted line is China. I mean, you're hearing a lot about Huawei, but overall, they are the big exporter now of electronics products. So, the Korea Times published this figure, and you can look at these at your leisure, but sharp decline in mobile phone exports for the past year and a half or so. This super cycle in chip exports was going up, 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 but this is the latest. This recent article in the Korea Times, I believe, falling chip exports from August of last year through January. This is a different quantification. This is year-on-year percent increase. But still there's a lot of concern. Networks are going to be integrated with robotics, and robots are going to be connected to networks as part of the Internet of Things. I think it's significant when we think in terms of future growth engines for Korea, that Korea is #1 in the world in robot density, number of robots per 10,000 workers. And this graph, just simply, it's color-coded. The large arrow is above the line, shows some of the major plans under different administrations, and that there's been a consistent commitment to growth of the ICT sector over different administrations. And in not Lee Myung-bak, but Nomuhyun administration, Dr. Oh was named Deputy Prime Minister, and the red enclosure shows how that was an attempt to bring together all of the science and ICT governance. And this set of slides here, I said there was consistent support across many administrations for the growth of the ICT sector. You might make the argument that Lee Myung-bak was the exception, because his administration sliced and diced everything, basically. And there was a 5-year-long debate. The Financial News here carried an article, color returns to the IT industry, but worry that the Korean proverb is "사공이 많으면 배가 산으로 올라간다." And they were talking about the need to restore a control tower for ICT sector policy. This debate went on for 5 years. So then President Park Geun-hye came up with the Mire Changcho Kwahak Bu and Ministry of Science, ICT, and Future Planning, somewhat awkward in English. Now the Ministry of Science and ICT. So she actually restored a high-level sort of governance over science and ICT, which has continued to this day. This chart really just shows that the future is going to be largely in software. If you look at the total global market for ICT products, 75% roughly is software and services. The other 25% would be for hardware. And this is data that shows, if you look at Korea and Israel, the first and the third bars, Israel is mostly pink, which is the software and services. Korea is mostly blue, which is ICT manufacturing. And this is business R&D expenditures. Really a stark contrast between Israel and Korea. So finally, and I'm going to keep my, okay, I'm going to really zip through this final session because I'm not a seer, but the subtitle of the forthcoming book is Lessons for a Sustainable World. Digital Development in Korea, Lessons for a Sustainable World. And I freely confess that the 2 chapters in the forthcoming book on sustainability and on the newest, sustainability is the big one. Also the relationship between disasters and public safety networks and next generation networks. That deserves a lot more work, but as with everything that preceded it, there's a continuous process of technological change, and at some point you have to deliver the book to the publisher and let it go into production regardless of, because even as I'm going through these slides, there are things that could be updated. This is from a brochure that the Ministry of Science, ICT, and Future Planning put out, but it still sort of applies. You have the 2 big dips in the increase in GNI, and then the question of what's the future going to look like? Well, now Korea has gotten up to $30,000 US, I think, or close on the I don't know if that's GDP or GNI, but disasters were also an impetus. In the United States, 911, in Korea, the tragic Sewol ferry sinking, led to FirstNet in the US and to SafeNet Forum, of which we are a member, here in Korea. And this is a Samsung graphic on how after we have this new public safety LTE network, we can be real-time interconnected when something like Sewol, God forbid, but it happens. So there were phases, and note, this is an old slide. National-wide network, December 2018. This has been postponed. It won't actually happen until 2020, 2021 because of one main factor: cost. Korea is very involved through SafeNet Forum, with FirstNet, with the other major efforts around the world to set up public safety networks. It's actually these 3 networks. It's the main public safety LTE, the LTE Maritime, and the LTE Railway that will need to be integrated. So it's a very complex engineering problem. Sustainability is just, I'll let Professor Yang chime in on that, but this report that I've reproduced the cover of here has influenced me because it argues that there are 2 main issues of profound importance: the challenge of environmental, really planetary sustainability, and the potential of ICT to deal with that. I've challenged my students to try to think of handling the sustainability issue without using ICT. It's almost impossible for me to think of how, into this day and age, we could do that. So, you're mentioned in the third bullet here, Mr. Gill. And I just want to say that I had the opportunity to interview Professor Young, and I was surprised. I learned quite a few things, but that this Presidential Commission on Green Growth had quite a few meetings. They were all attended by President Myung Oh, and Professor Young and the Prime Minister chaired them. But Myung Oh was there for the majority of the meetings. That's a statement. So there are 3 types of smart grid projects in Korea. The biggest one, it's one of the largest in the world, is the Jeju Smart Grid Project. And there are about 3,000 islands surrounding the coastline of South Korea. 300 of those are inhabited, and KEPCO, and KEPCO mainly, is in the process of extending microgrid technology to 86 of those islands as we speak. They started out with working with 30 projects. Gasa Island near Jeju is one of them. Then second and third, there are these urban-based smart grid stations, which simply means buildings that are in a large city, stations providing smart services, smart energy, and then energy block platforms for the industrial complexes. And one of the future items that I'd like to dig into more is the potential for Korea in building smart grids, because it's already got arguably the best digital infrastructure, fiber and so forth in the world. And you need backhaul. Because if you look at the diagram of a smart grid, the power grid lines of connection are all there, but then the communication and control lines are connected to every node, because that's part of what a smart grid is. And I think the next couple of slides, this Jeju Island, this is a diagram that you can read, and this chart just shows the difference between the existing grid and the intelligent power grid. Its current grid is a radial structure. The new grid will be a network structure. And I threw this in at the last minute, but KEPCO is actively involved in discussions among the countries in Northeast Asia, including Mongolia, but Japan, China, Russia, about the super grid. And the president of KEPCO has estimated this could cost $7 billion. There's a lot of controversy over it, but one of the aims is the 2 aims are to earn profit, but also to facilitate an efficient use of renewable resources from distant areas. So allowing Japan and Korea and parts of China to use wind energy and solar generated in Mongolia, for example, is part of the picture there. This is another graphic showing that supergrid. So on the left, you have the 4th generation current picture, the 5G, so-called 5G. By the way, I don't like the versioning. I ask my students, so is there going to be a 10G, 20G, 100G, 1000G, or where does it end? Because the versioning, and also it's not really an accurate picture of a more continual and somewhat political change, but clearly computing, communications, and storage, which we talked about earlier today, are going to move to the edge of the network, away from the core toward the edge. standards, international standards, the 3GPP, third generation, 3G Partnership for Standards, brings together 7 or more other international standards related organizations. So you can see that 5G hasn't really even been finalized. And then in today's Korea Jungang Daily, there's this interesting article. Korea might not be first, simply because Verizon is going to start 5G services April 1st, in the US. So, in the future, we may still ask who says what to whom through what channel with what effect. It's going to be in a converged set of digital networks.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
So I'm amazed going through that many slides. But thank you all for bearing with me. And as I said, the slide deck you can have access to. I'll make that available.
You said you had a meeting right now, or you needed to go?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Questions from anyone? Comments? Okay, Suga.
Yes.
Well, first of all, it was a very nice presentation, very enlightening, especially in terms of providing the very macro perspective on Korea's digital technological development. Unlike most of the studies done focusing just on insights within, on the views within, limited to the world of digital technology.
Right.
So it was good. I have about 2 to 3 comments. First, a very, very minor one, which is that the intellectual interaction between Oh Myung and Kim Jae took place actually somewhat before the launch of Chun Doo-hwan's brew house. That is, Chun Doo-hwan formed something called National Emergency Measures Committee in May, right after the Gwangju incident, I think. It lasted until mid-October, when Chun Doo-hwan elected himself to be the president. So he moved his outfit into the brew house. That's when Kim Jae followed him into the brew house. So did Oh Myung. But they had the more intensive intellectual discussions and communications during the period of the National Emergency Committee meeting,
Right.
between May and October. And Kim Jae was very busy picking up, identifying, and promoting what he considered to be Korea's new leaders to be, talents, including Oh Myung. And so they worked very closely together, of course, over the dinner and so on. And that intensive discussion and visualization of the setting the national vision on this matter took place, was formed basically before they both moved into the brew
It was
house.
before they moved in.
So there's a difference between the National Emergency Committee meeting period and the brew house period.
Right.
And I was one of the groups there. And
You were also involved in that from May to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
I was in the Economics and Science Committee.
I see.
I think Oh Myung within that National Emergency Measures Committee.
Right.
I think Oh Myung belonged to another one, which was about industry and technology, something like that. But anyway, we used to get together and have dinner meetings and so on many times. But that was only a very small episode. Now, you notice that there has been some radical change of perspectives and approaches between presidents since Roh Moo-hyun, Lee Myung-bak, Park Geun-hye, and this one. That shows up most starkly in the fact that they kept changing the name of that particular ministry that you're referring to in a very drastic way.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you did not mention the changes under Moon Jae-in. Now, I want to ask you
Right.
for your very quick observations about what the difference between those presidents as shows up in the changing of the ministry's name in terms of the perspective on how to promote technology, R&D, and digital development.
Yeah,
Well, for example,
yeah,
to me, what Park Geun-hye did not make much sense. But I don't know. You should be.
well,
very-
my take on that is that under No Moo-hyun, when Oh Myung was made Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Science and Technology, there was a recognition there that science needed to be brought together in terms of governance with ICT. So that actually is still reflected in the current, Moon Jae-in Ministry of Science and ICT. Prior to No Moo-hyun, there'd been a separate, Ministry of Science and then technology. And in fact, well, without getting too complex, because the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy is also a very powerful ministry. But the big sort of breakthrough, I think that started, or there was an attempt to start it under No Moo-hyun, was sort of bringing together science with the technology in the same ministry. And Park Geun-hye's future ministry was also an attempt
I
in
still
that.
don't know what you meant by creative economy, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I was following the press coverage at the time that the Mirebu was announced here, and in the Korean press, there was even some commentary that people had wondered about the creativity, the Changcho part, if that related to biblical concepts of creation, So there was a lot of questioning both domestically and internationally. But I think you can make an argument, I would argue that Lee Myung-bak, because he basically chopped up the leading ministries and gave them and then the Ministry of Knowledge Economy was largely influenced by former Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy people, so there had been that debate going on. I'm still wondering why Lee Myung-bak or his government, why they did that. Did they fail to see the connection between the technology part and science? Because science, I think, across the board is heavily dependent on these advances in technology. I mean, genomics, healthcare, you name it in science, and they're all making use of computing capability and big data and visualization and so forth for advances. But we could have a longer conversation. Actually, I want to talk to you less formally again about 1980, because so it was from May, and then when did
October.
until October was the
Mid-October.
period? Yeah. It's amazing how much you guys got done, given the turmoil. Can you
Actually,
address-
John Dwan is not getting the credit that he deserves as far as economic reforms
Yeah.
are concerned.
Okay, so you were there, Sugil. I think I would love to know what your personal experience of that period was. It must have been really crazy.
I can cover some of that
Yeah.
in my upcoming lecture
Oh, okay.
on April
That's
1st.
my interjection right there. I was
Yeah.
saying, that's a
Yeah.
whole other kettle of fish.
Yeah.
And one more a question. Do you see any particular way that the digital technology can be useful for us in coping with this problem of fine dust? Big question.
I mean,
I
yeah,
have-
yes.
Okay.
What comes to mind, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on network communication technologies, and a network of sensors that covered the more of the Northeast Asia region, and along with a political agreement among the nations involved, including Japan, Korea, China, maybe even Russia is affected by this. An agreement to trust the science, you know, when it comes to talking about how does this stuff originate, because I think you've got to be able to measure it, and that now relates, I think, to visualization. I read an article just this past week. It was in one of the local newspapers, but it caught my eye, on how with NASA photographs from outer space, you can see the fine dust originating in China, and over the Korean Peninsula, and even over Japan. And it's already been shown that you can see this, but the Chinese government is resisting what should be the obvious conclusions from that. You know, they're saying that these photographs don't show the altitude at which therefore, you know, they're not a good measure for, but I mean, it's there. Yeah.
I'm afraid I have to leave for my 2 o'clock class, but one final question. Is the digital technology or its prowess key, very essential to building a digital economy, so the service network, that is? You made a contrast between Israel and Korea. Korea focusing on digital technology, whereas Israel is also focusing on digital services. I wonder if that the Israeli approach probably is a more widely recommendable one for most of the countries around the world, because they do not have as much digital technology prowess as Korea does.
Yeah, my point was software and services. That services, and if I had to choose one of those 2 words, it would be the software. Because you only need, in terms of hardware, you only need one Cisco and one Hawaii, I'm not pronouncing that.
Huawei, I think.
Huawei, yeah, one Huawei, and a few other companies. There's a limit to the number of companies that can supply these hardware components. But software, you know, the cloud storage is there, so I think the challenge, I've said this before, Korea faces a real challenge to shift over toward more of a software and services emphasis. Yeah, I think so.
In teaching the mobile class for the undergraduates, that's the trend I stress, particularly in sub-Saharan development, that they don't have access to the global cities that manufacture the technologies or have the, you know, capital that's constantly needed to be cycled into new products. What they do have is brain power, and I argue brain power is more equitably distributed. So is solar panels. I mean, so if we build a society based on choosing materials that are more equitably distributed around the world, that's a better model. And Korea does fall against that because it has specialized in the global system of products around the hardware and done very well at that. I mean, it's created the standardizations. I mean, that's what I was struck with your presentation, that everything nearly Korea chose almost has become a successful standardization, except perhaps under One by San, the dissertation you're doing for One by San, where the attempt to force, you know, PKI, public key infrastructure, as a national plan. That never happened anywhere. But if you look at everything else, that's like still an A+ for everything else that's happened. But I wanted to get back to Sugil's main point before you got to go, I know, but I would say 2 things. One, right now there's, how can mobile technologies, you said, perhaps contribute towards monitoring this? Well, the citizen science is kind of the phrase I search for. And there's an interesting box that has been developed by British as well as originally Korean activists. They're engineers, but they're concerned about particle pollution. But now it's a global network of 9,000 little terminals that can be purchased around the world. It's called airvisual.com. You can go to airvisual.com, and it has a live global map of where 9,000 people or more have purchased these little terminals and put them on the web. So that's, things are getting smaller. So there's already a machine that you can buy for less than like $200 that will, at your will, connect to the network. You can just have it as a monitor for your house, but you can also make it a global map. And places like one doctor in Pakistan, for instance, Pakistan's too poor, they never built a national network. And both India and Pakistan are some of the worst places for particle pollution in the world. Not really China, it's really India and Pakistan. But one doctor put one in Islamabad as well as Karachi and started a national debate across the entire country about particle pollution. So one person can really change the world now with just two little machines connected to a global network that everybody can focus on. The second point, getting smaller. There's a picture I show in my mobile class of a smiling UC Davis professor. He's holding a smartphone in one hand, but this really large chip in the other. And he's smiling because he wants to put this chip into the next generation of phones. What's on this chip? It's going to monitor particle pollution. And your phones will be the AirVisual terminal. So,
well, I was just, okay, when I was 30 years old, I have very white skin. I had a melanoma removed from my right leg. It's a longer story, but I just saw a CNN report about the health service in Britain and how they're going online with connecting with patients. And one of the technologies they're using is you just take a picture of a lesion anywhere on your skin, send it in, and then it's AI driven. The
gives you pre-diagnosis. I've seen that.
It's
pre-diagnosis.
better than having doctors try to tell you what that is. It's much better. I would trust my life to the computer before I would trust a doctor on that. But that's another.
But
so,
also, go ahead.
Well, no, I think I just wanted to thank Sugil. Thank you for taking the time to stop by.
And
Mark, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Larson, for your first inaugural presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you.